Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my living room. I'm here today on this cold afternoon to tell you a few stories about the Cascapedia River, which is the river that is in my hometown. So I think it's a perfect afternoon to do this. I'm sitting by my little wood stove. I have my cup of tea, and I invite you all to get a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or something cool to drink, and we're going to sit around and tell a few stories. Before we get started, I would like to just give you a little update on why we're here and what this platform is all about. This Facebook Live session is brought to you by CAZA. This year, CAZA is launching this online culture and heritage trail to present the events, activities, products, and organizations of the English-speaking community of the Gaspé Coast for both tourist and the local population. To ensure that they don't miss anything that relates to the Gaspé, they need your help and information about any products that we have. And that includes heritage, culture, music, food, markets, historic places and activities, arts and crafts, etc. This is all about building a stronger English community. And for more information, please contact Crystal at 418-375-9070 or by email at crystal@casa-gaspé.com. And we'll put the information about that at the end of this presentation, so you'll be able to find that. But really, it's all about bringing people together to tell stories, to sing songs, to paint, to talk about what is Gaspésian for us. So, I hope you're ready to hear a few stories. So, why am I telling a story? Well, for sure, I've always loved storytelling. I grew up in a big family, and we used to sit around in the evenings sometimes, and friends and family and neighbors used to come over, and I remember Mom making a lunch, maybe cookies or something, and we would sit with a cup of tea, and I would sit back as a little kid and listen to the adults telling stories. There was all kinds of stories. There was ghost stories and stories of things about people from away who came home, or about the ships that had came in and brought stuff. I remember there was one story about the ships that used to bring molasses over, and we had a great big conch shell in our home, and we used to listen to the waves in it. So I loved stories. And in the year 2000, I was asked to go and to the Cascapedia River Museum. It was a brand new museum, and it hadn't opened yet, but they wanted to open it. So they asked me if I would go. Now, I didn't really know very much about museums, but I went because I had did a tourist planning strategy for the community. So they thought, oh, maybe I would be able to go in and help and get them started, because like the museum wasn't open, but they wanted to take it to open it to a market of people. And because, again, as we all know, a museum has to have people coming in its doors, or else it's just a museum and it just has a bunch of things. So when I went there, I really didn't know what I was doing. I seen a beautiful display. There was a gentleman called Pierre Rastul who had did that. He was a museologist, and I'm back again. Sorry, I don't know what happened. So everything was ready to open. And I looked around and I go, okay, well, how are we going to bring people to this museum? Because everything looks great. Everything looks well done. The one thing that was missing was the stories. Because you could see a beautiful reel, a Bogdan reel or a Hardy reel or a Spey fishing rod. You could see the fishing flies, the pictures of the big fish. But I knew it needed a story to go with it. Because what's an artifact? It's just a thing. And unless you're a fisherman and you collect them and you know them, somebody else is not going to enjoy it. So I went about looking for the stories of the Cascapedia, and I was very, very lucky to find so many, because I really learned that the Cascapedia River, it's fascinating. It's a journey into another place and time. Again, I grew up knowing about the river, knowing that there was this river there, and one of my favorite stories I remember as a child was hearing that my favorite person on television, who was Hoss Cartwright, for any of you that remember, there used to be a program called Bonanza, and Ben Cartwright had three sons, and one of them's names was Hoss. And I used to watch him every Sunday night. And I heard that Hoss was on the Cascapedia River, and I wanted to go and see him, but of course, we never got to see any of the people that came to the river. And that's one thing about the Cascapedia. It kept its secrets very well. The stories were told amongst the families, amongst the people that worked there. But they never went much further than that. So the secrets were all hidden in the generations of people who were working on the river or who lived beside the river. And it took a lot to start to get those stories out. But once the people started to tell their stories, it was amazing. So I'm going to tell you three stories this afternoon. One is a kind of a love story. One is a mysterious death. And one, of course, we can't tell a story of Cascapedia without telling a story of a big fish. So what I'm going to do to keep me on track, because if anybody knows me, they know that I can talk for a long time. I could be sitting here with you people at supper time, but I don't think that would be much appreciated. So I'm going to read some of the stories, because I did a lot of writing on some of the things of the Cascapedia. So to keep me on track and without trailing off, I'll read you a little bit. So I hope you're ready. And to put you in the mood of a Cascapedia story, I want you to imagine that it's a beautiful summer day. The sun is shining, and you've taken a drive upriver. And you see a place to park your car, and you see a well-beaten path that leads you down to the river. You're not sure whether you should go or not, but you do. You take a lunch that you brought with you, and you decide to have a picnic along the shore. So you walk out to the river. It's beautiful out. And there's an opening and a clearing. And you hear the river before you see it. And you know, finally, that you're on the Cascapedia River. There's a big canoe there. One of the guides must have tied up the canoe, waiting for their next fishing trip out on the river. So you're brave and you decide to sit in it. And you feel like you're almost sitting on the river. And when you look out on it, the waters, the sun is sparkling down. It's not too hot, there's no mosquitoes, and overhead you see a bald eagle fly by. Now it's time to tell the story. Hope you're ready. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the river. Just for some of you who don't know much about the river, I want you to understand why this river is so important. The Grand Cascapedia is an amazing fishing destination, for it has all the ingredients to take one on an unforgettable journey. It tells a fascinating tale about a fabled river and the lives of the men and women who shared a passion for the lure of fly fishing on one of the most famous Atlantic salmon fishing rivers in the world. Fate brought these angles and the seasonal temperature fluctuations of its northern climate. Like other rivers, an angler can spend a week throwing his line across its waters, only to leave empty-handed. Yet the promise of catching one of these Cascapedia giants comes to life when a fisherman looks across its magnificent waters. I think I got disconnected again. Sorry about that. The internet connection sometimes is not so great back here. According to Ron Swanson, the author of the book Record Salmon of the Grand Cascapedia, which is this book here, he says that there have only been 22 Atlantic salmon caught and recorded at 50 pounds or more in North America, and 17 of these huge fish were caught on the Grand Cascapedia, making it a river where great fishing stories are told. The Grand, as some call it, flows quietly through the valley of the community of Cascapedia St. Jules on the Gaspé coast of Quebec, Canada. If it could talk, it would tell 1,000 tales about the lives of people who came to experience the catch of the salmon on its waters. And it would also tell the story of the people who lived along its banks. It would tell the local folklore about the men who lost their lives during the log drives in a spring freshet, and it flooded their fields. It would also brag about the largest salmon taken from its waters, and some of the rich and famous who escaped their busy lives to find a sense of peace and balance within the hidden forest of the Cascapedia Valley. And it would remind us of the anglers who made their yearly trips to the river to replenish their supplies of fishing stories. And I'll just tell you this here. I'm not much of a fisherman. I've had a chance to go out on the river a few times and throw a line. I could tell you some of my other stories, but I won't. But there's something about having that opportunity to be in a canoe. You're away from everything. You're in the forest. You're just you, the forest, the water. I was in a canoe. I've also done wade fishing. When you throw that line out on its waters, and all of a sudden this beautiful silver fish comes jumping in front of you, you catch your breath, you can't believe it. I understand why fishermen love coming to the Cascapedia and waiting for that fish to rise. It's an amazing experience. So now I'm going to tell you my favorite story of the Cascapedia. When I went there, again, I had to look for the stories and I had to see how I could tell a better story to attract people to come to the museum. And I went into the documentation. They had a beautiful documentation center as well. And I remember one afternoon going into the documentation center looking for I don't know what, was just trying to put stories together. You know, I went there for 2 weeks. It was just supposed to be a 2-week thing to try to help them market the museum. And I stayed for 12 years. And during those 12 years, this became my favorite story. And if anybody who knows me, they know why. I found this book, if you can see it, on the documentation shelf. And I looked at the book, and I'm going, well, what does that have to do with the Cascapedia River? It was a book called Royal Rebels. And I thought, okay, I'll pick it up, I'll read it. I was trying to gather as much information. And I looked at the woman's face, and I thought, wow, there's something there. That woman, there's a story to be told there. And so I hurried through the pages quickly and tried to find out what her connection was to the Cascapedia. And what did I find? She was actually here on the Cascapedia, and she fished these waters. And she actually had a camp on this river. And I thought, how could that be? I have never heard that story before. I've lived here all my life. How could I not know that a princess, who just happened to be Queen Victoria's daughter, who is one of the most well-known characters in history, and here this woman was on our river and nobody knew about it? Well, I'm sure the people of the Cascapedia who fished at the camps knew about it, but everybody else, we didn't know about it. And so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about her story. And I'll go back to my storybook. Louise was born in England, in Buckingham Palace, in fact, on March 18, 1848, and she was the sixth of 9 children of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Louise grew up to be, she had a natural talent for art. In fact, she became a very accomplished watercolor artist, and she was also a sculptor. Her father died when she was 13 years old, and she took that very hard. And her mother, if you think back on what you know of Queen Victoria, she was very a dominating woman. It was all about her, and her children had to listen to her, and even as adults, because Queen Victoria lived to be a very old lady, her children listened to her. Well, of course, she had part of the world at her command, so for sure her children were going to be as good as possible. And again, what I want to say is Louise was not fascinating to me because she was a princess. That's not the thing. For sure, a princess on the Cascapedia, that sounds quite interesting, but it was the woman that she was and what I found out about her. Now, I talked to a lot of people, asked a lot of questions about how this woman ended up on the river. And I'll go back to the story and tell you a little bit more. As Louise was growing up, when she got to her 22nd birthday in 1870, the British public began to speculate about her need to choose a husband. She had gotten into a little bit of trouble, as young people do, and there was a little bit of pressure on her that she should find a husband, get married, settle down, etc., etc. She didn't really want to, but again, her mother decided that it was time. So in those days, they did interviews to see what prince they could find for her to marry. And they lined up a bunch of men, but she said to her mother that she didn't want to do what her sisters had did. She wanted to find her own man and marry a good-looking fella. So she chose John Sutherland Campbell, who just happened to be the Marquis of Lorne from Scotland. Now, he was considered a commoner, and the British public weren't very happy that she was choosing a commoner because she was a princess and the Queen's daughter. But she stuck to it, and she said that that was who she was going to marry, and her mother agreed because he was kind, he was good looking, he was also very artistic like her. He liked to sketch and draw, and he was a good person, so they accepted. So they got married, but unfortunately, it wasn't a perfect marriage because, again, she hadn't really fallen in love with him. She had been forced to marry him, and just to keep the British public and her mother happy. So you can understand that this wasn't a love story for her. So when Queen Victoria realized that they weren't so happy together, she decided, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to send them to Canada. I'm going to put him Governor General, and she'll follow, and she'll get busy in Ottawa, and it'll change their mind, and maybe they'll get along. Did it work? Well, I mean, they stayed together until he died as an old man, but still, they had their troubles. But what connection back here in Irishtown? Uh, so it wasn't a perfect marriage. So as I was researching, again, her story like everybody else, and remember, when you're working in a small community, you get a lot of fact and fiction. And my job was to sort through that fact and fiction and try to put the pieces of the story together as best I can. Now, I heard some stories about Princess Louise, about her time here. There was one of the stories where, because again, she came to Canada. They set up in Ottawa. Her time there was controversial. But in the summer, the first summer they were there, they came on a trip to the Restigouche River. And oh, by the way, on the Restigouche River, I just want to say for all you fishermen out there, her first summer there, she went on a fishing trip on the Restigouche River, and she caught 3 salmon during that short trip. Just saying, she was an accomplished fisherman. And before leaving Restigouche that summer, she took a trip to the Grand Cascapedia, which of course was becoming well known for as a salmon river. And they stayed at the Woodman House, which was a small inn along the banks of the river. According to my research, they stayed there for 1 week, and both the Marquis and the Princess found the experience to be very exciting, and they enjoyed the outdoor adventure. Louise caught a 40-pound salmon, and there was a wooden trophy made of that fish. In fact, according to Ronald Swanson, the salmon that they made of her, the cutout that they made, it's the oldest one that he could find, and Ron was a collector. And you may be wondering what a salmon cutout is. Well, to catch a salmon on the Cascapedia was a really big thing. So what they would do to prove that they had caught it, they would take the salmon, lay it on cardboard or paper, and trace around it. And then somebody would cut that out and do on a wooden board, and that would be the shape of the salmon. And they would proudly put their name on it, and the weight of the salmon, of course, the pool that it was caught in, and the date. And they would hang it on the walls, and in many of the private camps on the river, you're going to see the cutouts of salmon. And I mean, it's really nice because those cutouts take you down another part of the history of the Cascapedia River. And it's still being done today because it's so interesting. I mean, I learned so much from those salmon cutouts while I was there. So Louise did catch her 40-pounder. But there's another thing that I want to tell you. Now, and I'm switching back and forth, which is why I often read my stories. Ron wrote the story of the biggest fish caught on the Cascapedia. But It's all the big boys who caught the fish. But I found in my research, because I did so much on Louise, that Louise was said to have caught a 50-pound salmon. Let me tell you a little bit about that. During my research, I found a reference that the Princess Louise had caught a 50-pound salmon, and she sent the big salmon back to her mother in England, who had it mounted at Windsor Castle for a time. Where I found that, there was an old magazine called Outing, the Gentleman's Magazine of Sport, Travel, and Outdoor Life, which was published in 1893. One chapter was called Canoe Poling for Fish on the Grand Cascapedia by R.F. Hemingway. In it, he wrote that the best polers he had ever seen were on the Cascapedia River. The story goes on to tell about the head guide who shared his experience when Princess Louise was his guest on the river. The event which he staked his reputation on was the capture of a 50-pound salmon by the Princess Louise while she was a passenger in his canoe. He was modestly tentative about the details of the incident, but he repelled with considerable indignation the intimidation that he had hooked the fish for her. He had, of course, imparted to her as his pupil something of the naval art which he himself cast the fly, but he stoutly declared that the royal lady had hooked and killed the fish, one of the largest salmon ever caught with a fly in any country. But Louise never made it to the history books. But for me, why not? She could have caught the fish. Unfortunately, I don't have any proof. I don't have any pictures. But back then, who did? According to everything that I read about Louise, she was very happy during her stay on the Cascapedia River. She enjoyed the wilderness. She enjoyed her times out on the river. She enjoyed painting and sketching. And at one point she wrote that she preferred the mosquitoes on the Cascapedia to the buffoons in Ottawa, which give you a little bit of an idea of what she thought about Ottawa. But then let's go to this business of the story about her and her fishing guide. See, that was part of the folklore of the Cascapedia. I heard that Louise had painted her guide. That the first stories I heard about her was that she had painted her fishing guide in the nude on the river. And again, fact and fiction, you try to find the truth in the story. So I did a little bit of research. Louise, during the day, sometimes she didn't accompany her husband on his fishing excursions. Sometimes she went off by herself. And they did hire a guide by the name of Richard Duthie, and he's a relative of the Duthies that still remain here in Cascapedia, St. Jules today. And apparently, when I was doing the research, I came across some of the other paintings that she had did. One of them was called Wooden House in the Cascapedia, and it was a watercolor that reflected the tranquil atmosphere of the river. And they said that was one of her best pieces of Canadian art. But she also was said to have done another one called Richard Duthie, Boatman on the Cascapedia River. And I knew from the stories that had been told about the princess that, yes, that had to be. One of the stories that came up was that she seemed to be very fond of her fishing guide, Richard. There was multiple versions of the story about him, and I knew that there had to be a thread of truth in it somewhere, despite what the local gossip said. Apparently, Richard helped Louise catch her first salmon on the Cascapedia, and as a way to thank him, she named a pool after him, Duthie's Pool. And it's still a recognized landmark on the Cascapedia, and just upriver from the pool that's named after her, called Princess Pool. There's also the story that when she left the river, she gave him a mirror, a hand mirror, which she had painted her face on. And she told him that whenever he would look in the mirror every morning to shave, he would see her face and he would not forget her. When I asked what happened to that mirror, I was told that Richard's younger sister had scratched the princess's face off the mirror for some reason. Maybe she was his younger sister and she wanted a mirror. So my quest became, how do I find out more about this Richard Duffy? Was there any truth to it? And so I looked through the pictures and I couldn't find a picture of Richard Duffy. And I found a picture though. I made phone calls, and through the family down here, the Duffy family here, I found his granddaughter who was living in Alberta. Coincidentally, the province that's named after her because her name was Caroline Louise Alberta. The family knew very little of his connection to the Cascapedia River. They just knew that he had came from Cascapedia, but he had never talked very much of his time here. Um, so I knew that there was a Richard Duffy. I knew that she had painted a painting because the family out west said yes, there had been something about a painting that she had did of him. So I began to really look for it. I went to the National Archives in Ottawa. I went to the McCord Museum. I had hired a researcher to try to help because we were trying to put the whole story together. I'll tell you why. It was because we were doing a traveling exhibition. We were going to do an exhibition at the museum and also send it out to Alberta for different venues, which we succeeded in doing. So I was trying to put the story together as well as possible because it wasn't just for me anymore. It was going to be an exhibition. I didn't find anything under the name of Richard Duthie, my boatman. But by accident one day, I was sent some slides. And on one of the slides, there was a series of like stamp-sized images. And a small picture caught my eye. I was able to get a screenshot of it in larger format. And when I compared it, because it was a picture of a man, when I compared it to the picture that I had received from the family out west of Richard Duthie, I knew it was the same person. The only thing is, it wasn't called Richard Duthie, my boatman. It was called Portrait of a Young Man. The odd thing was that this man was dressed up as a French artist with a red beret. So it left me wondering if she had intentionally wanted to add another painting of him to her work, and it became maybe a playful joke between the two of them. Or maybe she never really wanted anybody to know her relationship with him. So she kind of hid him behind a beret. So I still really didn't know enough about the story. One afternoon in the museum, because going through the museum I had the opportunity to meet many fishermen, etc., and I met a gentleman by the name of Ori McPherson, and I told him about my quest to find more about the Princess Louise and this painting that she supposedly did of him. And he said that he would look for me, and he sent me back. He was from Iceland, and he sent me back a sketch that he found because he apparently knew Prince Charles because they had worked together on salmon conservation out in the Atlantic. He sent me a picture of a man in a boat that she had did, but the man was standing up, so I knew that wasn't it. Again, I kept looking to try to find out more until I came across a book. And the name of the book was called, it was written by a gentleman called Higginbotham, and he had written a book called How the West Was Young. And in it, he wrote an article, and I just found it by chance. He says, one day, as I sat in my large canoe, he writes that he had, he said that he had been to an exhibition in Ottawa, and he's seen this painting. And then when he went into a place in Alberta, he ran into Duthie, and he looked at him and he asked him if he had ever been painted by the Princess Louise, and Richard Duthie said yes, that he had been her boatman, and that she had painted his picture. So then, to prove that he was right, he wrote to the Princess Louise, and she wrote back to him saying, "It was very kind of you to tell me of the amusing little incident about Duthie. He was a first-rate man." This is Louise writing back. "He was a first-rate man and a fine-looking fellow. It was a great disappointment to my husband and myself when Major de Winton, our military secretary, persuaded Duthie to go and work on a ranch for him, which he had bought in Alberta, and we therefore had not the advantage of having him with us that summer during our last year in office. We love the river and the settlers around it. Let me thank you for your kind tribute to the likeness I did of our boatman Duthie. Yours sincerely, Louise." So we know that there was a connection between Louise and Richard. We know that she did paint that painting. And and it was evidence that there had been something between them. I found another little piece of writing that she did. She wrote in one of her watercolor art books that she had did on the Cascapedia River, and it said, and it was handwritten by her, and it said, "In nature's presence many a wretch proclaimed about his feelings gush, when silent I with a hasty sketch would paint her language with my brush. Thus something of the joy she gave for other days I tried to save, and make the scenes I gathered there, if not to art, to memory dear." So what was the story of Richard and Princess Louise? I think that Louise found herself in a place away from her mother, her family, her country. I think she found her a place on the Cascapedia River. She was alone. She spent the days with Richard Duthie fishing. He didn't care who she was. He had never been around a princess before. He was just a regular guy from our community. And so he treated her with much respect, I'm sure, as a woman. And since Louise had trouble in her marriage, maybe this was a time that she shared that she didn't have to be more than she was. She could just be Louise, the woman, and Richard could just be him. Whatever happened, I think that they did have a strong relationship together. I think that they enjoyed each other's company. I don't think she painted him nude in a canoe. I think that she left with a heavy heart, and I think that he became a part of her life. They said that Louise changed after her trip to the Cascapedia River, that something in her changed. It was said that her and Lorne had drifted apart, and in fact, in 1981, she did not come back to the river. She went home to England. Now, there are many stories as to why she went back to England, and I'm not going to get into these right now in this part of the story because we're on the Cascapedia. Let's just say that the Cascapedia River changed Louise and left and gave her something that changed her life. I think that's a pretty good story. And my favorite. And like I say, there was something to that story. But she was a very complex woman who led a remarkable and fascinating life. And her time here on the river became part of the heritage and culture and the folklore. And I'll leave it up to you to imagine that's for another time. So now we'll get on to another story. Oh, the time is passing, and I'm going to try to keep this within the 1 hour mark. I don't know if anybody is asked if there's any questions or anything like that. Let me just look here. Let's see here. I'll just take a minute to look on my computer. No? Okay. I hope that it's working. Merci, okay. Some people, okay. I can just see here. Okay, so at least you're seeing it. Now I'm going to tell you another story, which is quite different. Just let me scroll down this. Just a second, please. Okay, this is another story, a little bit more exciting. And it was a story that I had written for the magazine Gaspésie. And it was about a mysterious death on the Cascapedia River. And I'm going to read this so that I don't drift off. And I hope you don't mind. So remember that you're still sitting on the banks of the Cascapedia listening to these stories. It is a beautiful morning in the month of June. Well, in fact, it's June 19th, 1908. In the woods, you're all by yourself. And all of a sudden, you hear a gunshot. Now let's get to that story. The sound must have disturbed the tranquil stillness of a morning on the Grand Cascapedia River. Within moments, the lifeless body of Edmund W. Davis lay slumped in a large rocking chair on the front porch of Red Camp. This tragedy ended the life of one of the most famous salmon anglers on the World Cascapedia River. Mr. Davis was a salmon fisherman who had been coming to the Cascapedia River for 13 years. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1853. He was the grandson of Perry Davis, who was the inventor of the painkiller medication, which was an elixir widely used for a variety of illnesses, colds, coughs, and intestinal problems. The painkiller enabled Edmund's grandfather to accumulate a great fortune. Therefore, Edmund lived a very privileged life. His love for hunting and fishing took up most of his time, and he enjoyed the social aspects of the sport. In the 1880s, fishing on Canadian rivers was becoming a well-established sport that required money and connections with the right people to acquire the rights and the privilege to fish. The Quebec government felt that by leasing the river's fishing rights to the highest bidders, they would be making money as well as passing on the responsibility of managing the rivers to the leasers. It also meant that the American and Canadian fishermen would become the guardians of the river, willing to spend what it would take to safeguard their investment. The competition to gain the rights of the Salmon River were becoming a sport in itself, and the Grand Cascapedia offered the best chance of landing a specimen of 50 pounds or more. After he got married, Davis met a Mr. R.G. Dunn, the founder of what we know today as Dun & Bradstreet, a financial firm. Mr. Dunn had been coming to the Cascapedia River since 1873 and had established a friendly relationship with Joshua Woodman, who was an owner of an inn on the Cascapedia River called Woodman House. Dunn returned year after year and brought with him his many rich and influential friends, including a gentleman by the name of Chester Arthur, who later became President of the United States. In time, he received permission to build himself a small fishing camp on the Woodman property along the river called Red Camp. Dunn knew Davis enjoyed salmon fishing, and so he invited him to the Grand Cascapedia to enjoy the Cascapedia experience, as they called it. Davis soon became captivated with the possibility of catching one of the giant Atlantic salmon that the Cascapedia was producing. In one of his writings, he refers to this wish: should Dame Fortune be kind and bring down the scale to one of 50-pound notch, my ambition in life will be fulfilled and my happiness complete. So we knew what he was after. Davis returned to the river year after year. Since he was financially wealthy, he was able to come without the constraints of having to work for a living. He enjoyed the company of Dunn and other fellow anglers, and soon he began to seek out opportunities to establish his right of his own on the river. He also brought his wife and son to the river, for they enjoyed the sport as well, despite the rugged setting of the Gaspesian woods. Both successfully. Each of them caught a 46-pound salmon, but it was David himself that brought in the biggest catch. In 1900, David was fishing in Woodman's Pool, and after a short fight caught a 51-pound salmon, which he described as the river goddess. His dream of catching the big salmon had been realized, and he was able to photograph the event and the fish for historical record. There is also an entry in his logbook the following year of his catching another 51-pound salmon. These two 50-pound plus Cascapedia giants made him a much talked about fisherman, and I'm sure that his accomplishments reflected well on him within his social entourage. He had successfully landed not one but two of the trophies that other anglers could only dream of catching. And there is even the possibility that he may have caught the third one, according to another entry in an earlier logbook. If so, it would make him the only angler to have ever caught three Grand Cascapedia giants weighing over 50 pounds. It only happened once that we know of, and for sure it'll probably never ever happen again. When Dunn died in 1900, David was able to acquire his rights to Red Camp. And again, just to give you an idea, Red Camp was just alongside of Woodman House, and Woodman House is where the Woodman family still live today. And it's that beautiful spot down by the river. It's big red barns and building. It's beautiful. If you ever take a drive upriver, you'll notice where it is. Yes, the river was a place of happiness for Davis. But what happened on that fatal day of June 19th in 1908? The mystery surrounding his death is still questioned 100 years later, more than 100 years now. What made that gun explode on that fateful morning? Who pulled the trigger? Was it an accident, as some claimed? Was Davis cleaning his gun when it backfired? Was he alone when it happened? Or was his son Stuart with him? Did Stuart try and stop him? Or was he involved in a mercy killing? According to some of the local folklore, the employees had heard an argument in the camp the night before. Who was arguing? Some said that Davis was going through a separation from his wife Maria at the time. Others say that it was Stuart, and that most likely killed him, possibly to collect his inheritance. Was there a possibility that David, who seemingly led a privileged life, chose to end his days by committing suicide? The only clues that could have been found that would suggest suicide was that just before coming to the Cascapedia River that year, he had been to Egypt. And on his return trip, he happened to be on the same ship with Robert Patterson, who also shared fishing rights on the Grand Cascapedia. In fact, he at one time was the owner of the camp that we now know as Horse Island. In a letter that Patterson had written to another colleague on the river, he stated that Davis was a very sick man and that he possibly had Bright's disease, which was a disease of the kidneys. Davis also resigned from the Cascapedia Club early that year, which was not in keeping with his interest in the river. We do know that he did return to the river only weeks after returning to Egypt, and that he was accompanied by his wife and his son. He even fished from his choice pool and landed a 30-pound salmon. The last entry in his logbook was made on June the 16th, 3 days before he died. He had caught his last fish, a 16-pounder on Harrison Pool. A major twist to the story is that just months before his death, he had published another privately printed book called Woodcock Shooting. In it he wrote, "Is not the instant killing a more merciful end than that of starvation or through the misery of old age? Shooting, in my opinion, is the least cruel and quickest way of ending a life." It was said that Davis had a fascination with guns and had been heard saying that someday he would possibly take his own life. Davis's body was removed from Red Camp the next day and taken back to Rhode Island. Since no crime had been reported, nor any evidence collected, it was reported that Davis had been shot accidentally. The story that was told along the river was that he had accidentally shot himself in the head while preparing to go crow hunting. Most of the local storytellers say that the body had been found in a large rocking chair on the front veranda of Red Camp, overlooking the river with a rifle in his lap. So what did happen on that early morning in June to one of the best fishermen to have ever fished the magnificent waters of the Cascapedia? Maybe he found himself at a place in his life where he knew that he was facing a greater challenge than even he could deal with, and he refused to die the painful death of Bright disease. He would have surely heard his friend Dunn talk about Chester Arthur, who had succumbed to the death because of Bright disease years earlier. How ironic that the grandson of the inventor of the painkiller medication that was supposed to be a cure to all that ails men was not able to cure himself. Maybe he knew too much about the pain and suffering of the fatal disease and decided to take his own life by the means he had claimed to be the quickest and the least cruel method of dying. Here on the Cascapedia, in his favorite place overlooking the river that he so loved, he probably felt that he had control over the situation of his failing health and was at peace with his decision. As he pulled the trigger, he may have looked out onto the river and repeated to himself, "Here, where all is happiness, where all is peace." There's an old saying that dead men tell no tales. Therefore, we can only speculate what happened to Edmund W. Davis. It's most likely that he will continue to be a topic of conversation, and the mystery of his death will continue to fascinate us. The rocking chair where his body was said to be found after shooting is on display at the Cascapedia River Museum and remains a constant reminder of his link to the heritage of the river. Davis's story, I remember doing the research for Davis's story, and again, trying to separate fact from fiction. And I worked with some very good people who helped me in my quest and were able to find bits and pieces to put it all together. Davis had written a small book called, just a second, just to make sure, called Fishing on the Grand Cascapedia. And in it he wrote about the flies that he used and the reels and the rods, and he wrote about his river goddess, his big fish. And he wrote in it the famous quote that he wrote in it, such a beautiful country is not an accident. God must have created this wonderful wilderness where all is happiness and all is peace. That book he only made 100 copies for, and he gave to his friends. And there was a second printing of it again that was distributed among people who really wanted a copy of it. There is a copy at the Cascapedia River Museum. As far as I know, it's still there. And those copies, when we went to look online for to buy extra, they were listed at $3,000 and more. So they became a collector's item. And Mr. Davis will go down as part of the heritage of the Grand Cascapedia River. Imagine catching 3 Cascapedia giants. He must have been a very proud man. And now on to the final story. And this one here is about the fish. I like to say the fish that got away, even though it had been caught. This fish is about Esmond Bradley Martin. This is a very interesting story and a fun story to chase. He was born in Long Island, New York. Again, the Cascapedia River brought so many people of influence, so many of the rich people. A lot of people came from New York to the river. It became their playground, even though it was called the Governor General's domain because of so many Governor Generals finding a place to fish on the river for their terms in office. It was also an attraction for the rich and elite of New York. So as I was saying, Mr. Martin was born in Long Island, New York. He was an intelligent man, a graduate of Princeton and Columbia University, and he was the grandson of Henry Phipps. And I'm sure, like that name doesn't mean anything to you. But Henry Phipps was a partner of Andrew Carnegie, who was a steel magnate in New York and the builder of Carnegie Hall. Now, you may have heard of Carnegie Hall in New York, which is known as the most prestigious concert stage in the United States. Carnegie controlled the most extensive iron and steel operations ever owned by one individual in the United States, and he became one of the richest Americans in history. So, since Mr. Phipps was his partner, Mr. Phipps was a very rich man, and so his grandson, Esmond, who is a character in our story, was also a very rich young man. Now, Mr. Phipps, Mr. Carnegie's partner, he had 3 sons and a daughter called Amy. And they found their way to the Cascapedia River, and they built Camp Schler to enjoy their summer's fishing. But to make this little story a little bit more interesting, the daughter, Amy Guest, she was married to Frederick Guest, who just happened to be the nephew of Winston Churchill. Yes, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Just in passing, so you kind of get the gist of the story. Now, Amy was a strong woman and with a very strong personality, and she loved the Cascapedia. She believed strongly in women's rights and actively supported women's causes such as the right to vote, and she helped to fund hospitals and programs for women's health. So even though she had the means, she used her money for a lot of good work. So here they were all coming to the Cascapedia River. They formed These rich people, they formed the Cascapedia Club. So they had the rights on the waters, they had camps, and they formed a club to manage the river and make sure that everybody respected some sort of rules and regulations, and it wasn't overfished, and they just wanted to keep everything a certain way. And it cost a lot of money to keep this Cascapedia Club going. So during the Great Depression, which lasted from I think 1929, started in 1929 to around 1933, the stock market fell, and these people were starting to find it a little bit harder. They were losing money like everybody else, and they started to question the need to spend all their money coming to the Cascapedia River fishing for salmon so far away from home. So, at a meeting in New York during this time, they gathered, the members of the Cascapedia Club gathered, and they were ready to say no more. Like, we can't keep this up. We can't keep putting money into the Cascapedia River. Some of us are going broke, etc., etc. So, when they were just about to fold, this Amy, she raised her hand at a meeting, and she said, listen, boys, I'll take over the river. I'll take over all rights. And that's exactly what she did. So Amy Guess ended up taking over the rights to the river. She came back to Cascapedia, and even though her brothers had this beautiful camp called Phipps Camp, which became known as Camp Schiller, she decided to take over New Doreen, which had been built by a Governor General, Lord Lansdowne. And I love all the camps on the river. They're all beautiful. But New Doreen has a special charm. There's something about it. It has a beautiful pool in the front. Walking through the camp itself, there's something very special about it. So she took over that camp, and she had it fixed over and much to her liking and that. So she was quite happy. But her story doesn't stop there. She just didn't settle down and enjoy her fishing and go on with her life. No, Amy was that kind of a woman. Do you remember the story of Charles Lindbergh, who made his first solo flight across the Atlantic in 1927? Do you remember that story? That made the news. It was quite the famous affair. Well, our Amy decided that she wanted to fly across the Atlantic. She wanted to be the first woman to fly or be flown across the Atlantic Ocean. Well, that didn't go over too well with her family. And finally they talked her out of it and saying that, practically she was going to kill herself. Like, no, don't do that. You don't have the experience. You can't take that up there now too. So she listened to her children. She let the matter go. But it still nagged her. So she decided to sponsor somebody else to fly across the Atlantic. And I'm sure we've all heard of Amelia Earhart, who made the first, she was the first female aviator to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And yes, we know that she disappeared in July of 1937. So, but our Amy Guest here from the Cascapedia, who owned New Doreen Camp, she funded her first flight across the Atlantic. Just saying, just so they get an idea of who this woman was. Now, Amy was a skilled angler as well. She was good. She had been coming to the river since she was a child with her father. But the largest salmon that she ever caught was a 44-pounder. And even though she was quite proud of this beautiful salmon, and I'm sure she had the trophy put up in New Doreen Camp, she wanted a Cascapedia giant. And every year she would come back to the river trying to catch a Cascapedia giant. And in case I didn't mention it before, a Cascapedia giant is a salmon caught in the Cascapedia River that weighs 45 pounds or more. So Amy's 44-pound salmon wasn't going to go into the record book as a Cascapedia giant, and she wanted one. During the summer of 1929, the guides along the river began to talk about a big fish. Now, guides are always talking about a big fish because you can't tell. A guide, the work of a guide is to tell fish stories. And so whether you have a guest in the boat and there's no fish around, the guide can keep that guest entertained by telling fish stories. So a guide, part of the skill of a guide is to be able to tell a good fish story. So the guides that summer began to talk about seeing a big fish in the water. They had spotted it, and several of them had seen it, and that became the buzz thing about what was happening in the river. And they said it was a really big one, and many hoped to be able to hook it and pull it in and claim it as their own. Well, our Amy heard about it too, and she wanted to hook it for herself and hang it as a wooden trophy on the wall of her camp with her name on it along with the weight. Uh, so they fished and they fished, but then along came our Esmond Bradley Martin, her nephew, who was her brother Howard's son. And again, he had been coming to the Cascapedia River since he was a child as well. So on the morning of June 27th, 1929, this young Esmond Bradley, of 24 years old, went out on the river with his guides. He threw a Lady Amherst fly across the waters, Aunt Amy's waters, that is, in New Doreen's waters, in the upper jam pool. How long it took, I don't know. But it did happen. That big fish took his fly, and he caught a 55.5-pound Cascapedia giant. Now you can imagine how proud he must have been, and like he had caught the big salmon that everybody had talked about. Needless to say, his Aunt Amy was not happy with him. That was her fish, and it was said that she never invited him back to the river ever again. But he didn't leave empty-handed, because he took his fish with him home to the States. Yes, he left the Cascapedia with his fish. They didn't eat it. They didn't throw it back in the river, because it wasn't the custom at that time anyway. He took it back to the States and had a taxidermist mount it and preserve it as his own Cascapedia giant trophy. It was said, though, that the locals lined up to see the fish before it was packed on ice to make the long trip home, and some of them tried to get their picture taken with it. And it was also said that people stopped him along the way as he went home to get news about it and to talk about it. I'm sure he was very happy to talk about his big fish. Now, you would think that this story is over. He caught the big fish, he went home with it, but it isn't. You see, when I found out about him taking his big salmon home when I was working at the museum, I wanted to know where the big fish ended up. Like, where did it go? So he took the fish home as a young man, and I knew it was a long time ago, but where did the fish end up? And was there a possibility of the fish being out there somewhere? A few people told me that it had been in the Museum of Natural History in New York for a while. And somebody then sent me a picture of it, a picture of his mounted fish, and sure enough, you can see his name is written on the bottom of it. So I called the museum, and I asked them, the curator, I think it was, if they had such a fish. And she said that they would do a bit of research. And they got back to me, and they said, nope, that they didn't have such a thing. And I said, well, what would have happened to it? It was supposedly in your collection. And she said, no. She goes, after such a time, a fish like that will just deteriorate and have to be thrown out. So I was very, very disappointed. And then we heard that maybe we decided, well, maybe Esmond Bradley would have it as well. And I think it was Hoagie who was supposed to go and meet him. He had been on a trip, Hoagie Carmichael, who did so much of the research on the river. He had been here in early June that year, and he was going to go back and try to go and meet with him. But then we found out, Hoagie had been here at the end of June, and he was going to go back and try to find out. But that same year, Esmond Bradley died on June the 16th. So he had just died, so it was too late. So the fish was passed on to his family. Years later, somebody told me to get in touch. In fact, it was one of the camp owners, to get in touch with, I think it was his daughter or granddaughter. So I had her name and her address, and I wrote to her. But she didn't want to part with it. Like, it was to stay within the family. So, like all good fishing stories, Esmond fish became part of the folklore of the Cascapedia. And I think it's still out there. It was some people said that it was the biggest salmon ever caught at 55.5 pounds. Is that true? I don't know. There's 3 or 4 others that weighed in at 53 to 56 pounds. In fact, our Mr. Dunn that I talked about in Davis's story, right now he's kind of listed as the one with the biggest fish. There's even a story of, in fact, I have a picture of it right here, and I'll try to show you on the back of a book. And this is Mr. Dunn, who had his picture taken with his big 54-pound fish. And even though Esmond's fish was 55.5, they say that Dunn's fish probably weighed more. It probably weighed 56 pounds, but it was only weighed days after, while Esmond's fish was weighed right away. And if you wait to weigh a fish, it loses a bit during the thing. So they've kind of said that Dunn's fish was bigger than Esmond Bradley's fish. Like I said, there was a local person who was said to have caught a salmon over 60 pounds. And for him, it wasn't a trophy fish. It was actually a fish, according to what they've said, to feed his family. So, as you can see, the Cascapedia River has many, many stories. I've told you a few here today. I've kind of went all over the place, but there's so many stories out there. Before 2000, before the museum opened, the stories, these 3 stories and so many others, just remember, kind of lost you again for a second, but because of the 2 volumes of work of Hoagie Carmichael, we have so many of those stories, and I know there's many other stories to be told. It was interesting how a community came together to tell their stories, to share, and I think at this time, as we are all shut in and having to stay home a lot and spend a lot more time with our families, I can encourage you to tell more stories. Tell your family stories. Sit around together and share that, because we're the holders of our family stories, but the generations to come, they want to know those stories. And for me, I spent years trying to go back and find the community stories. And I mean, I've told you the stories of the rich, some of the rich people and the famous people here today. But there was also the stories of so many. You don't have to be the rich and famous to have a good story. You know, there was the stories, again, some of the people in the community. Wesley Harrison. I mean, he was an amazing man with an amazing story who I love to hear stories from. There were some really great storytellers on our river. You know, there was the story of Bing Crosby coming to the river, and Charlie McCormick, who was his guide, and I was able to see the pictures in that. There are fascinating pictures. So the guests came to the river, but this is where the people of the river lived, and they all had stories. And for sure, there's more of those stories to tell. And in Hoagie's book, he did tell a lot of the stories of the local people as well. So I encourage you to take the time in this strange and surreal time that we're living in to gather your family stories. And have the children listen in on them too, and maybe write some notes down, and go through your old pictures of the old aunts and uncles and grandparents, etc., etc. Because we're too dependent right now on social media and television, and our stories are being lost. So that's the end of our storytelling for today. I hope that you got something out of it. I hope that it's really hard to sit here and tell stories to a screen. I'm going to be really honest with you, because there's nobody to get feedback from. So you're just talking to talk. So it's kind of a different experience. But I hope that you got something from it. And I encourage you to go to the Cascapedia River Museum, because, again, the history is all there. And Julie and Kathy will be happy to take you on the tours of the museum and tell you so much more. I want to give a special thank you to the Gaspesian English Heritage and Cultural Entertainment page for giving me this opportunity to share these stories with you today. And I encourage you to support all their efforts in promoting the English heritage and cultural activities of the Gaspé Coast. And I also want to remind you that right now, because we're in this strange period of time, CASA and Vision, which are community organizations, they've put out a survey, and they're asking you to fill it out to see how people are coping right now and what are the needs in the community. So it's only a few questions. It'll only take a bit of your time, and it's really worth doing because, again, a community that works together, that supports each other, makes for a much better community in so many ways. So thank you to everyone. If you have any questions, you can get back to me. I hope I made myself a bit clear, even though I rambled on a little bit. Until next time, take care, stay well, and stay safe. Bye for now.